Hello, hey, welcome back. I am going to go over some of the highlights of the Paulo Freire reading. By now, I'm hoping that you have either read the whole thing or at least made an attempt at it. But I'm making this video basically just as a follow-up. I'm going to go over some of these highlights. I've highlighted some things that I think are pretty important, or at least that identify some particular terms that I think you should be familiar with from this point on because I will return to this. Again, my assumption is that you will have already read this, so this is just my way of sort of pointing you in a direction for the short-term stuff that we're doing. But then in the long term, you guys should be a little bit more familiar with this, maybe than what I can do here. But still, I think this may wind up taking a couple of parts to go over completely. And I have some handy little pictures that I'm hoping might help some of the stuff you may be able to look up on your own if what I'm saying is not making any sense. You're always welcome. I mean, you're at home, so I guess you could Google anytime you want. But I'm hoping that this will give you some idea of what I think is important, which is probably what you should think is important. Okay, so I'm going to start with the top. As you can see, I have the chapter 2. This is an excerpt from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Expressed. I'm going to go over some of these things. So here I'm pointing to the narrative character. You'll see that the first highlight identifies narrative character. Now, that is essentially the narrative that we were talking about before. I may have mentioned in terms of a story. When you think of narrative, you think of story, right? That's kind of what he's talking about. He's saying that anytime you enter into in this case, a student-teacher relationship, you're involved in sort of a narrative. You're involved in a story. And going back to that idea of social scripts, how social scripts sort of develop the way we respond in given situations, that I think is very closely related. And I tend to use those terms a little bit interchangeably, even though maybe technically they're not completely interchangeable. But that idea of narrative, I think, is really important, and I use it both in the capital N narrative and the smaller n narrative, as in just a regular story. But here he specifies sort of that what I would say is called a capital N narrative, meaning sort of a specific term that I'm thinking of. He's saying that the relationship involves a narrating subject, the teacher, and the patient listening objects, the students. What he means by that is that when you're involved in this narrative of the classroom, meaning the story of the classroom, and sorry if that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around, but think of anything in the sense of text, as we've talked about before, how anything that can be read can be taken apart. Any situation, you can identify sort of how those relationships work. That's kind of what he's talking about. But when you think about the schoolroom, you think of this. He's saying that you can think of the teacher as the subject, meaning he's a central idea, right? The subject in a sentence is like the thing that everything revolves around, right? So in this case, the subject is the teacher. The teacher is sort of the determining factor, the focus of everything, right? Because I'm the important person, in other words. The students being the objects, meaning the thing that's related to the subject, are you, right? You're a student. You're related to the teacher only in so much as how important you are to the teacher, right? So in other words, you occupy a space that's not as important as what the teacher is. And that's sort of the traditional idea of what the narrative of the classroom is trying to identify. Okay, and his task here in the second little highlighted portion, his task, meaning me, could have said her probably, is to fill the students with contents of his narration. In other words, you come to this classroom as objects, meaning you're just sort of sitting there waiting for me to act so that you can act upon me. And my relationship to this narrative, meaning this story, is that I have these knowledge units, right? There's these units of knowledge that I'm imparting on you, right? And you are to take them, and when you have enough of these units, you will have essentially gained knowledge and be filled, okay? And a way of looking at it, and you might see this graphic a lot online if you sort of look around for it, is that you can think of it as you are essentially an empty vessel, right? You're here empty of knowledge, right? Or at least the knowledge that I can impart on you. And so as you can see, I'm the hand that sort of has these knowledge units that sort of puts them inside your head, right? And so once you've had enough of these knowledge units, I give you a test or something to see how well you've been filled, essentially, right? You're sort of these receptacles. And here in this third highlighted portion that I'm going to point to here with my mouse, you see that he actually does use that term of containers, quote unquote, containers and receptacles to be filled by the teachers, okay? And so the more completely me, meaning me, fills the receptacles, the better the teacher she is, okay? So that's how you evaluate whether your time here is useful or not, right? You know, am I a good teacher? Did I fill your head with the knowledge units, and now you can measure those units and move on with your life, right? Education, traditional education, has sort of revolved around this idea, and what Freire is saying is that that relationship is oppressive, right? It puts you in a position where you're just this passive being, accepting that I have the knowledge unit that I can put in you, and that is what knowledge is. It's sort of what he would call, and I think he does refer to this later on, as the banking method of education, okay? You're banking knowledge units in the hope that if you gain enough of these, you will gain prestige and be a knowledgeable person, okay? The banking concept of education. And here it also says, instead of communicating, which is, you know, sort of how we learn in our regular life, right? When you think of it this way. When you're learning something in regular life, right? Regular life meaning outside of the academy, meaning in Freire's terms, something that's not oppressive, you kind of just talk to people, right? You sort of learn things along the way. You have practical applications. There's mistakes to be made, but it's all part of sort of knowledge. But in this case, you're not really communicating, are you? You're just sort of waiting for me to fill you up because I have the authority to do that, right? And you're just sort of passive in the whole concept. Essentially what he's saying is that's not real knowledge and not real learning, okay? So the teacher communicates and makes deposits, which the student patiently receives, memorizes, and repeats, okay? So this works best when you have measurable units, right? How do you create an institution, or at least a bank of knowledge that isn't based on this sort of oppressive idea? It's hard, meaning it's not easy to do, and it's not in many ways measurable. So knowledge is not necessarily measurable in a way that we want to think of it in terms of units, okay? So that's kind of what he's getting at. And that knowledge outside of this model is less oppressive than knowledge within this model, okay? So I threw that term oppressive out there sort of randomly, but he gets actually a lot more specific with sort of what that, you know, quote unquote oppression represents. Okay, it tends to mirror the society that's oppressive. Okay, that's sort of his. I wouldn't call it a thesis necessarily, but in this chapter, that seems to be the central focus: is that oppressive societies, or at least tend to feed into this oppressive system, and the oppressive system tends to feed into the oppressive society. So what is the purpose of this? Well, there's a lot of different purposes, but the result of this is that the teacher teaches and the students are taught. Okay, so that's your role. Your role is to be taught. Everybody knows their roles. Everybody's clear. Teacher knows everything, and the students know nothing. Okay, so that's and this is ideally, right? Ideally, if this were sort of an ideally oppressive system, for example, the teacher would know everything and the students would know nothing. Why is that important? And there's a bunch of other little factors that go into effect here, but I think I'm going to focus on that, at least for this part, because this is kind of what I'm leading up to. What does that mean? That means the teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. Essentially, why that is preferable in an ideally oppressive system is that the system essentially sets people up in opposition to each other, and that's kind of how oppressive systems work the best, right? So if you think of it in this term, the teacher-student, right? Teacher-student relationship. Let me give you an example. If a teacher, what's the opposite of red? This is one of the things that I pose to my class sometimes, okay? What's the opposite of red? Blue, okay? What's the opposite of up? Okay, and this is usually the easy part of the lecture, right? Because people can respond. There's not a trick question. What's the opposite of up? Down, okay? What's the opposite of left? Okay, right, right? What's the opposite of teacher? Student, right? So if you set these up as opposites, meaning in opposition of each other, that sets up a neat little correlation, at least logically. Okay, so how do you define what is left? It's that which is not right, right? How do you define what's up? Well, it's that which is not down, right? So what are the characteristics of these? Okay, that's where we get into the sort of the tricky semantic argument, meaning just sort of playing with words part. Okay, so what is, and another thing that I'll pose, and maybe I'll pose it here. It's like, think about all the things that you think of when you think of the best teacher ever, right? Okay, what's the best teacher? I don't know. I get all sorts of answers to that, but like the best listener, right? He listens a lot, right? What's the best, or maybe that's a little hard to go through. Let's go maybe even more basic. What is a best teacher is really knowledgeable, right? Knows his stuff, knows his or her stuff, right? What's the best, what other characteristics of the best teacher? Provides really good knowledgeable feedback, right? In other words, like the best teacher is the one that knows the most, tends to, knows all the ins and outs of something, can communicate, tends to talk to people. Okay, so those are just a couple of examples. Okay, there's a lot more maybe that you can think of, but anything that you would think of as the ideal teacher, if we think of this in oppressive sense, right, teacher and student, we think of the student as the opposite of that. Okay, so if the best teacher is the most knowledgeable, what is the opposite of most knowledgeable? Least knowledgeable, right? So that's kind of the trick that you can play sort of semantically, is that anything that you can think of, any good qualities of a teacher in an ideal scenario, if you think of the student as the opposite of that, it puts you in a position of inferiority, okay? And the best learning doesn't necessarily take place within that structure, okay? And that's kind of a little intro to what some of these, how he's identifying some of these terms. And again, I'll point to banking education. And if you think about these little portions that I have highlighted, they mirror the society as a whole, and he gives you a lot of different ways of looking at that. Okay, so follow some of these terms, and then see that he also has, I'll scroll down to this part here, and it says problem posing education, and this is the part where it says indeed problem posing education, which breaks the vertical characteristic of banking education. Okay, this is where he starts to offer maybe some solutions, some alternatives to that banking model of education, where it's just sort of like these measured units of knowledge, right? Sort of you could look at it as a more organic way of looking at knowledge, okay? That is maybe outside of the system that a quote-unquote oppressive society might want to institute, okay? Well, I hope that walks you through a couple of terms that I want you to be aware of. Problem-posing education is probably important. Narrative is definitely important. That teacher-student relationship is probably pretty key to understanding. That idea of banking education, another term that I might return to, that's also important. And the narrative and when you talk about, looping back to that idea of narrative, if you think of it in terms of that social script idea that I introduced you to earlier, that might also be helpful because, like I said, I tend to use those terms interchangeably. Okay, well, I hope that helps. That just gives you some of the highlights. It's not comprehensive. Again, I'm just sort of giving you some terms here, and I'm assuming that you're reading and following along with all of the other exercises and units. And to follow this one will be a discussion board where you guys will go back and forth, okay? And hopefully we can learn a few things from that too. Okay, well, thank you very much.